too hot.
Too hot.
Yeah, and it's which is sad because I understand, like, I don't want it to be super cold, believe me, but all right, there we go. Okay. Good deal. All right, everybody. So Shimon had Tzaddik, I think we did what we were going to do.
Yes, we did.
Okay. Although I will say, well, okay, that's, I know we did. Okay, let's go on to Antigonus. Antigonus, man of Socho. Okay.
Where is already?
That's a good question. Where is Socho? I don't know. I don't remember where Socho is.
He's got a woman name. Yeah, with a name like that.
Yes.
It is.
Yes. All right. So what does that tell you?
That tells me we've already got a diaspora, or we've got somebody who learned to get along with the Romans. Or we had a funny mother. What?
Yeah.
A funny
Yeah.
mother.
Yeah. What it tells me, I mean, among other things, I think basically we've already said this, right, is that we have an idea, right? It is very common in the Jewish community, right, of some sort of how to put it in a non-offensive way.
Several different traditions.
Well, no. What I was going to say is that we have this notion that there is a genetic purity, so to speak.
Oh, no, there is.
Right? And, that you're only Jewish if your mom was Jewish, right? And you have, and everyone who is Jewish is really Jewish, blah, 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 whatever that means, right? And I think that what we have here, right, is fairly clear evidence, even from the very beginning, right, that Jews, right, from the very beginning of diaspora, right, and not the second diaspora, but the first diaspora.
Even before.
Right.
When they entered the land of Canaan.
Thank you. Right. When they entered the land of Canaan, they came with an Erev Rav, right?
There were a lot of other people.
A lot of other people. And then what did they do? They went, according to the Bible, I'm not saying from a historical perspective, but according to the Bible, right, they entered into the land of Israel, right, where there were all kinds of people living, right? And if you were with me for our discussion of the book of Joshua and later books, right, there are these at least two streams in those books, right? There's the stream that the rule was that they had to kill everybody, right, that was there so they could have their pure Israelite, society. And then the other one was, right, that there were a lot of people that just stayed there and lived among them, right?
And they married them.
And they married them, and they had problems with the same problems that we have when we marry.
There are always problems.
If you have a marriage, what do you have? Trouble, right?
When you marry outsiders, you got in trouble.
I think they
have the same trouble with insiders.
right. They used to say they used to say about Jews, right? There's no marriage that's not a mixed marriage, right? Because this one went to this church, this synagogue growing up, and this one went to that synagogue growing up, and they can't decide.
They're doing it today. Who's Squad kosher?
Right? Exactly. Who?
It never ends.
One at a time.
My father was a Louisiana. This was a mixed marriage in 1927.
Yes. Exactly.
But question, so Antigonus probably means something like counterpoint or so.
Yeah.
Now, what would the Hebrew equivalent of that be?
I don't know.
Oh, okay, never mind.
That's a good. No, I'm sorry that I didn't have the time I usually take to look at the commentary on this, which would equip me with some of these answers. But I'll look it up for next week. And
Could I ask a question?
yes.
Could Antigonus, because he did receive the oral tradition, be a convert?
Yes.
That's another possibility.
Right. Right. There are converts all throughout, and actually in the piece of Gemara, right, the piece of the Talmud that I'm planning to learn with everybody, I learned part of it with my Chevruta. Chevruta is a study partner. I learned some of this with my Chevruta, and in fact, one of the stories has to do precisely with a question of a convert, right? And so, conversion is also a reality, right? conversion and intermarriage go together, just as they do today, right? All right, so good. So all of what we've been saying so far is speculation, right? I don't know for sure about a lot of this stuff, but I think it's really interesting to sort of realize that there is a complexity, right, of obviously a genetic kind of complexity going on, even in this sort of time of sort of mythic purity. Okay, so he used to say, do not be like servants who serve the master in the expectation of receiving a reward, right? But be like servants who serve the master without the expectation of receiving a reward. And let the fear of heaven be upon you. All right.
That's really stretching it.
What? Stretching it.
What is it? What is it stretching?
What it's stretching that if you do something, you don't expect a reward.
Yeah.
Well, this sounds more like it's the fear of the stick rather than the idea of the carrot. That,
Yeah.
Well,
so
yeah,
you're not expecting to receive something, but you're afraid that if you don't do what you're supposed to do, you're incurring the fear of heaven or the wrath of heaven.
but the mere posing of it as receiving a reward, as opposed to receiving the his salary, or whatever you want to call the salary, which is his just pay for work. I mean, if he's a servant, he gets paid. If he's a slave, he doesn't get paid.
Yes. So these are very important. So you're beginning to get, right, already some of the method of the rabbis, right? Which is to say, to make statements, right, that automatically, almost reflexively, lead to pushback, or what is he talking about, right? How can he say that? Like, what does it mean, right? And again, I think I said this last week about, probably have to say it every time, right? Is that, in these, part of the point of wrestling with these ideas, right, is not that these are supposed to be sort of, old adages, early to bed and early to rise make a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Okay, fine, whatever, right? These are supposed to make us have a conversation about them, right? So just a few things. I think it's very important, right, that in Hebrew this gets very confusing, right? Because the word for slave is the same as the word for servant,
I bet.
right? Right? So very complicated, right? It's also the same, it's from the same root as laborer, right? So an oved, right, is a laborer or a worker, right? An eved is a slave or a servant.
No.
I'll put Connie. Okay. So there's always going to be a question of translation, right? And the word avodah, the same root, right? We saw that root word, right, up here. Where did it go? Al ha'avodah,
The second one.
right? Al ha'avodah is here, right? Which is translated in this one as
Service.
temple service, right? But it basically means divine service. So what you do for God, right? And why do we serve God? And that might actually be a helpful thing to grapple with. When we're saying that we're serving God, what are we doing? Well, I mean, these days, yes, we're praying, right? In the old days, right, when there was a temple, right, it was that elaborate system of animal sacrifices and all that.
Sweeping the floor.
Right.
Okay.
And so what's the point? Why would we do that kind of labor? That whether it's an elaborate sacrificial system or an elaborate prayer system. Why do we do it?
Yeah, I think the word labor is what you want rather than work.
Maybe, yeah. But does anyone have an idea of an answer to that question?
Why do we labor?
Why do we labor? We said that the temple service, right? The labor or the work we do for God, right? The holy work we do for God is one of the things that keeps the world on its tripod, so to speak. Right? It's one of the legs of the tripod. Right? We've got Torah is one, we've got Avodah is the other one, and we've got acts of piety, right? Or kindness, whatever, however you want to understand. So why?
Because you assume that somehow this is what God wants you to do. Now, whether you expect God to reward you in some way, doing this is a whole other conversation.
Okay, great. So Sandy and Connie, did you hear what?
Not a word.
Okay, so Naomi, why don't you come a little closer to my microphone because I'm happy to repeat what you said, but I think it would be better if people heard you.
Because you are doing what God tells you you should do or what God asks you to do. But in my mind, what you may expect from God as a result of doing this is a different conversation. You're just doing it right now because somewhere it is written or it is spoken that this is what God wants.
Okay, great. All right. Does anyone have? So from what Naomi is suggesting, right, is why do we do this labor for God? We do this labor for God because God said God wanted it.
No, I think we do it for ourselves to help the people, to help others.
Okay, so that's
You
great.
can knock God out of it.
Yeah. Okay. So, as you know, Sandy, I'm always happy to leave God out of it. And it's, I get in trouble sometimes with my fellow rabbis because my theology is shall we say a little loose.
A different perspective.
Exactly. But I'm asking a different question than the one you're answering, Sandy. So the question you're answering is why do we do mitzvahs in general, right? And the mitzvahs that we do in general, right, by and large, a lot of us do those mitzvahs, even if we don't necessarily believe in God, right? Because we know that those mitzvahs are good for other people, right?
Exactly.
And when we do good for other people, right, we know that there's an immediate reward, right? There was just yet another article in the newspaper. There's all the time there are these articles in the newspaper. If you really want to be happy, go do some volunteer work or go help a friend or what, that's how you're happy, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. That, Sandy, is the gimilut chasadim, right? That's the practice acts of piety, right? That's what that is. I'm asking specifically about the second tent pole, right? Al ha'avodah, right? Which before the destruction of the temple was the sacrificial system, right? And after the destruction of the temple became the very elaborate liturgical structure that we have in Judaism, right?
Yeah.
And so what I'm asking is, and it's fine to say, as Naomi does, right, that we do it because God told us to do it, right? But that becomes kind of a tautology, right? We do what God said because God said. Well, fine, but God must have a reason, right? Or we must have a reason why we would bother to do all that kind of stuff, right? So what might that be?
The reason for doing Gemilas Chesed is because that serves another person, and we're
Right.
leaving God out of it.
Okay, well, we established that, right? And as I said, I'm very happy to leave God out of it, but I'm gonna push you all, right? That the reason that we do this, right, is because, and I'm not saying we personally, right?
Go to the last line,
Yeah,
which talks about you don't want to, or because of fear of God, or
Fear of heaven.
fear of heaven, right?
Yeah, and let the fear of heaven be upon
Yeah.
you, which is a separate phrase, but which answers in a way.
Yeah.
It's not because you expect a reward, it's because you're afraid of what
Yeah,
might
so
happen if you don't.
So we'll get to that, right? We'll
Alright.
get to that, and I think that's really important to remember,
I
right?
think
What's the word beginning with a C? Means something like a compact or
A covenant.
covenant. That's what I'm.
Right, it's a covenant, right? It's a covenant, right? And that's the issue, right? That's the issue right here with Antigonus's statement, right? Which is that it's an absurd statement, right? On the face of it, there is no servant who's not a slave, right? As Phyllis already pointed out, who doesn't receive a reward for his labor, right? It just doesn't happen. Right. So the question is, well, what is the reward? Right? What is the reward? What do we get in return? Right.
we would go to heaven for,
Okay. So right. So that's possible.
okay, so he does what God wants, or when he gets sick or something, he would go to heaven. And
Sure, that's great. So that is an option. I can't say for sure that Antigonus, right, at the time that Antigonus was active, that was what would be motivating him. It probably was a little bit. I don't know. Was it a little later? Was it the same time? Anyway, I don't have a firm grasp of the chronology here. But what I'm going to say, right, is the reason, right, that we have this as one of the three pillars of the world, holding the world up, right, is because, as I said, right, Torah, right, is kind of about how people, right, are supposed to see the world, right, understand God, right, and the Gimilut Chasadim, as Sandy has repeated to us, right, is about relationships between people themselves, right, and the temple service, right, ha'avodah, whether the service in the temple itself or the service of the heart, right, as the rabbis call prayer, right, is about our relationship with God, right? It's about how a Jewish person, right, comes close to God. Right? The word for a sacrifice is a korban. And the rabbis like to say, right, that's the same root as lekarev, to bring close. Right? So if you offer a sacrifice, if the Israelites are offering a sacrifice in the temple, what does it do? It gives God a place to dwell amid the Israelites, right? It says in the book of Exodus, right? Builds me a mishkan, right? Not so that I will be able to dwell in it, right? But so that I will be able to dwell among you, right? So we do avodah, right? We do avodah not actually in expectation of any kind of material reward, right? More, we do it, right, so that we will have a close relationship with God, right? So that the presence of God will be with us, right? So one of the things the Jews say, right, is that there are many, many ways to pray, right? And pray not in the sense of prayer, although that is true also, but prayer in the sense of avodah, right? That there's many ways to bring God's presence down to us, right? That's one of the things about my particular theology, right? Is I have this theology that God is almost always, not always, but but God is, I find access to the presence of God most readily in context when I'm learning or praying or singing or doing whatever it is I'm doing with other people, right? Which is not to mean I never have sort of religious experiences by myself, and I spend a lot of time by myself. So but there is some sort of fundamental distinction, right? That in building this community of learners, right, for the hour that we're together, right, that God dwells among us, right, as sort of part of the, and that there's no, and that in a sense, what I would say, I would argue here that what Antigonus is trying to get at, right, is that the service itself is its own reward, right? You don't go to shul, right, because you're gonna, that when you leave shul, come on in, Muriel. That when you leave shul, they're gonna hand you a 20, right? I mean, first of all, you're not supposed to handle money on Shabbos anyway, right? So that would be muktzah, they call it. But anyway, but the point is, right, that you do it because if you go to shul, then you've been in shul, right? And you've had an opportunity to connect with other members of the congregation. You've had a chance to connect with the divine, right? And you've been able to sort of take hold of a little bit of that spirit of holiness that comes when people come together for prayer. Right? And so I think that's what Antigonus has in mind here, right? And obviously we can, and it doesn't have to be the 20 that they hand you on the way out of shul, right? It can be other kinds of rewards as well, right? You don't go to shul to show what a pious person you are, right? You go to shul because you want to be at shul with your community.
Somebody has their hand.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Connie. Thank you.
She's muted.
Oh, we can't hear you.
And she's working on it. There we go.
What's the meaning of the fear of heaven?
Yes. Okay, good.
I mean, I would think that people who observe the commandments and so forth will look forward to the Olam Haba positively, without fear.
Yes, exactly. All right. So this gets into another question of language, right? And this is a very complicated subject, right? And so there is a variety of different words in Hebrew that translate in English to fear, right? So, but they mean different things. It's sort of like love, right? The word love in Hebrew is ahava, right? In Greek, right, love is eros, and love is agape, and I think there's even a third one, philia, right? Philo, right?
Oh, right.
So you've got they all translate as love, right? And what does that require? It requires that in a translation, you could mistake one kind of thing for another, right? Right. So you could have eros, and it means love, right? But that's different than agape love, right? One has to do with sexual desire, right? Other kinds of physical drives, and the other one has this. That has very much to do, right, with the Greek division between the body and the spirit, right? An inheritance that came down to Christianity very, very strongly. It's not a mistake, right, that in Judaism, right, in Hebrew we have ahava, right? I love my wife, right, and I love my food, and I love God, right? They're all the same. It's all the same word, right? So in Judaism, there's much less, right, of that division of body and soul, right? It exists, right? We're not going to pretend, right, that we have two different blessings, one for the body, one for the soul, every morning, right? But there's not this hard divide, right? That there is in Greek philosophy. All right, so that's the issue with fear in Hebrew. So the kind of fear, the kind of trembling, right, fear, right, is can be pachad, right, or it can be harada, right? The Haredi, right? The Haredi Jews, right? Those are the quaking Jews, right? The trembling Jews, right? They have a real fear of God, right? But even that, right, is less about fear of punishment and more about awe, right? More about the sublime hugeness of God, the sublime oneness of God, right? So if you think about, going up on, even on the 10th floor, right? You go up to the 10th floor and you look over the skyline one way or the other, right? And it's kind of an awesome view, right? And we say awesome view. Now the word awesome has become kind of devalued, right? Because everything is awesome, like, oh, I went to the baseball game. That's awesome. It's a baseball game, It may have been an awesome game, but whatever. But the point is, awesome really means like it gets you, right? It hits you in your kishkas, right? It really moves you, right?
Is the word morah fear? Is that
yes, that's exactly right. So this word morah,
not like teacher?
It's not teacher, because you see that this one is
An aleph.
Is an aleph, right?
Yeah.
A teacher is a hey
Yeah.
at the end, right? Although I love it, Connie, right? I love the idea that a teacher, can inspire terror. I remember being terrified of various of my teachers. Yeah, I had a 6th grade teacher who was the most amazing teacher. She was one of the ones I remember most clearly. Her name was Mrs. Como. She was an Irish woman who was just an astoundingly good 6th grade teacher. And my father used to make fun of me about how intimidated I was by her. And he would call her Commander Como. And but anyway, yes. So this fear is from the root yud resh ayin, right? And we do see that same word as fear, but really it's usually much more in the realm of awe than it is in the realm of fear of punishment, right?
Thank you.
And obviously you cannot always separate them, right? If you climb up Mount Washington, you get to the top, and you're sitting on a cliff, and you're looking over the view, right? There is awe, but there's also fear, right? Because, oh my God, if I take a wrong step, that's it, I'm done, right? And so there, so I don't want to pretend, right, but there is always, and I think that this is one of the things that is difficult for us in our secular age, right, to fathom a little bit, right, is the sort of the awesomeness of our life, right? That very often the most important emotionally laden, potent moments of our life, right, are the ones where we have a sense of awe and fear, right? Anyone who was married, right, there is obviously great joy, but there's also, we were just saying before, right, if you're going to get married, you're going to have trouble, right? So there's a certain level of awe there. Anyone who's had a child, right, the awesome responsibility, right, of for women of giving birth, and for both parents of having to raise this child, right? And then there's the other, when you realize, like, oh my God, what have we unleashed on the earth in this child, right? There's that sort of fear and awe.
Sometimes Yom Kippur and maybe the period around the holy days, are considered days of awe.
Right. That's exactly right. The Yamim Noraim, right?
Yeah.
So Norah, I'm imagining because of the Resh and the Ayin, the Resh and the Aleph, that it's the same. It's a similar root. I would have to double check that. But right, that's exactly right. And very often in the high holidays, right, we focus on the fear, right? How fearful are we, right? But again, like, why are we fearful? Are we really fearful because God is going to smite us? Well, maybe, right? But really, I think what the high holidays are getting at, right, is about to bring us to that point of sort of recognizing the awe that with which we, on one hand, need to see our life, right? On the other hand, if we lived in Yom Kippur every day, that would be the end of our lives, right? Not only because we would be fasting every day, right? That's not the primary reason, right? The primary reason is that you can't have that peak experience all the time, right? You've got to live in the world. Yeah, go ahead.
Here's a thought. What if you thought of the high holy days as a period when things suddenly stand still?
Right.
So it's the astonishment of it.
Yes.
And that's another way of thinking of it.
I love it. And
I
go
like
ahead.
that. I like that better.
Yeah, another way of that the rabbis think of Yom Kippur, right? The reason that we don't eat, we don't have sex, we don't wear leather, we don't wash ourselves that day, right? I brush my teeth, not for me, but for other people. Right.
It's a health measure.
No, one day. There's people that don't brush their teeth for weeks on end, and they seem to be fine. But no, it's just that's neither here nor there. But talk to my kid when he was younger. But no, it's also I love that actually, because when I was first Jewish, when I first converted, they asked me to say something at the high holidays at Temple Israel, and I said that it does feel to me exactly what you said. It feels to me like the 10 days of repentance are like this sort of belt buckle of the year, right? It's sort of there's like this little break you take, right? Later I learned, right, that and I talked about this in my Yom Kippur sermon this past year, right, is that it really is about death, right? It's about imagining your own death, right? It's about coming to terms with the fact, right, once a year, sort of recognizing in a deep spiritual and emotional way, right, that we really are mortal, right? And it's easier maybe for people who live here, right, to acknowledge that, but I don't think in general it always is, right? And because as in many traditions, right, one of the goals of Judaism, right, is to help us come to terms with the fact that we are mortal, right? Go ahead, Connie.
And not only death, but how? Because in Rosh Hashanah, we ask, how is it going to be? Is it going to be by fire, by water?
Right.
How are we going to do it? All that unknown.
Exactly. And I think that is actually more important than the various macabre ways that we might go, right, is the reality that we don't know, right? And we not only do we not know how we're going to die, we don't know when we're going to die, right? But we know we're going to, right? And that on at least 2 or 3 days a year, right, our liturgy is all about that, right? That we sort of come face to face with that reality, right? So that's how I understand this fear of heaven, right? As I always say, really religion and spirituality is about what is going to work for the person who practices it, right? So I think that one of the things it's so interesting to me that there's so much emphasis in discourse about religion, and especially about Judaism, right, which has to do with this nasty and terrifying God, right? Now, on one hand, it makes perfect sense, right? Because unfortunately, in the Torah and other places in the Bible, that God is pretty terrifying. And because Jews tend not to be the type of people who say, oh, this isn't very pleasant, so let's just erase this, right? And we'll pretend it's not part of our tradition, right? We just always, it's like, no, it's there, we got to deal with it, right? But I think that, so on one hand, it makes sense, right, that there's this emphasis on the punishing God, right? On the other hand, right, the rabbi, starting with the prophets, and this is where this is really relevant, this first little piece, right, is really relevant, right, is that the prophets, like Moses, right, as I said last time, right, they received this word kibel, right? They received it. Somehow there was something more, right? That Moses received it and the Nevi'im received it, right? I'm sorry. Right. Not that they received it, but that they passed it on, right? That they passed it on. And so you'll notice, you'll see again and again in the prophets how they change the nature of God, right? They clearly conceive of God in a different way than the Torah conceives of God, right? And then the rabbis continue that work, right? The God of the rabbis is not the punishing, quote unquote, Old Testament God. Right? And the problem that we've got, right, is that it was very important for a certain group to emphasize the punishing nature of the Jewish God, right? And what group was that? The Christians, right? Because just like they had the same Torah and the same prophets, but they didn't follow the rabbis. They had their own group, right? And they did exactly what the rabbis did, right? They came up with a new version of God, right? But they had it easy, right? Because the rabbis, as you see here, were obsessed, right, with the continuity, obsessed with the continuity of the tradition, right? The Torah that God gave us on Sinai is the same Torah we have now, right? It doesn't say that God is the same. It doesn't say it's the same God. It just says it's the same Torah, right? But everyone assumed, of course, that obviously it's the same God too. It's the same Torah, it's the same God, right? The Christians are able to say, right, no, we have a new covenant, right? We have a brand new covenant. This is not the old covenant, right? We have a new covenant, right? So they call that the New Testament. And, that's based on the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and elaborated by, Saul, who then later became Paul. He was a nice Jewish boy, that's Saul.
Yeah.
Very, he was actually not such a nice Jewish boy, but that's a mistake. All right, good. So any questions about this? Any objections? Any thoughts about this? Okay. All right. So what I was going to say, right, is that the fear of God, right, the fear of the punishing God was very useful for the Christians. And we live in a very Christian country.
It's still there.
And it's still very Christian, right? And even the Jews, right, are very influenced by the Christian idea that our God is somehow different than the God of the Christians.
Well, the Christian God is part of a whole family. Ours is one.
Right, exactly. So there's a complication there, right? There's a complication there. Now I always struggled with the Trinity when I was Christian.
Oh, it's more than the Trinity. There's the Mary.
Oh, there's the Marians as well.
I mean,
Yeah.
the
But that's
whole
later.
family is
That's a little later, though.
Oh, yeah, but the whole
yeah.
family.
Yeah. But I think what's important to know, right, is that this idea of the Trinity, right, is also a unity, right? That it is a unity,
Yeah.
right? No less than our God is a unity. but there's three. So that's why it's a mystery. It's this thing you can't understand completely rationally, right? It's a matter of faith.
I can be wrong, because I'm often wrong. But I always thought of the one God of Judaism as, yes, one, but one also means alone.
Yeah, I would actually use a different word.
Okay?
I would use unity.
Yes, you used unity.
Right.
And it's different.
Yes, but again, the thing is, like, even the rabbis will say that God comes in many forms, right? That at the edge of the sea, God was an avenging hero, right? A military leader who was fighting for Israel, right? On Mount Sinai, right? That was the God with the long beard with the lawgiver, right? So even the rabbis play with this all the
He
time,
was a lawyer.
right? I'm sorry?
He was a lawyer.
He was a lawyer.
At Mount Sinai.
Or something, who knows, right? So the rabbis are very comfortable, right, with the idea of a God of many names, right? And even in their more playful moments, a God of many forms, right? Which is not, I mean, it's not the same as the Trinity. I mean, I'm not pretending that it is, right? But it's also maybe not so very different also, right?
Yeah.
But it's not any different than a human being. There's many sides to one human being.
Exactly, right? I
You know,
think
we
that's
have many different things within us that are
right.
different.
Shirley, that's so lovely, right? Because it's so important, right, to remember, right, this way in which we have the tradition in both Christianity, Judaism, and also in Islam, right, that a person is created in the image of God, right? And so as multifaceted, right, as God is, so multifaceted is a human, right? And so, right, if there are moments when we have to be warriors, right? And then there's moments when we have to be peacemakers, and there's moments when we have to be nurturers, and there's moments, right? And that's everybody, regardless of gender, regardless of station, right? We all have these moments, right? I don't think I've ever fired a gun in my life, right? But still, right, there's been moments where I've had to, serve as a
Want to
kind
punch
of,
someone in the nose.
well, God forbid, I did get into my scrapes when I was a kid, but try not to do that now. But yes, but the point, very long and gestating here, right, is that that religion works for people in very different ways, and one of the reasons I think that the punishing God works is so prevalent is that on one hand, it's so much part of our culture, so useful for Christians and for people who are uncomfortable with religion, right? To use that as a reason why, I can't do that because I can't believe in a God that's like that, right? And so there's a famous rabbi, Lawrence Hoffman, who used to say when people would come and tell him, I can't believe in God. Then he said, well, what's that? What's this God that you don't believe in? And they would describe this punishing, nasty God, and he's, I don't believe in that God either. So there's that, but I do think that there are people for whom, right, this notion of punishment, unfortunately, does motivate them, right, to do stuff. And I worry about people like that, right, because it's not. I don't think that, and these are often people who punish themselves, right? And that's another way that I often think about God, right, is that it's what's within you, right? It's how you conceive of whatever it is that's greater than you, or your most truest self, right? And if you're not honest with yourself, if you're not compassionate with yourself, you can be very self-damaging, right? What we say to ourselves is very often worse than what anyone else on the planet would say to us. And so, that punishing God is often within us, so to speak. Not to get too twee about it, but all right. Any closing thoughts about this one?
It's heavy.
Naomi, did you say something?
No.
Okay. All right. So I would love to. So I was going to tell you who Antigonus is, if I could figure it out. It says right here, the first noted Jew with a Greek name. He lived in the first half of the third pre-Christian century. There you go. And Socho is a place mentioned in the book of Joshua. So it's obviously somewhere in Palestine.
One, maybe?
I don't know where.
Okay.
All right, so just popcorn style, feel free to share something that you learned today, something that you're coming away with.
That I should be nicer to people.
Yeah.
Yes?
I don't know, are you not nice?
I don't know either. Some
I
people
don't
may
either.
think I am. I don't know. Oh,
I thought that you got to be good to people, help people out, so that they could help other people out.
Nice.
See, the multiple concepts of God.
it's interesting. Huh?
Because according to my mother, her mother would always say in Yiddish, you can't do that, God punishes.
Oh,
That's interesting.
was she the lit one?
She was the lip on.
Yeah. Clearly. Don't listen to your mother, Naomi. Listen to your father.
The lips were a different story.
Yes, yeah. Oh, yeah. But but you're right. I mean, that is a way in which, that I'm listening to a book about psychoanalysis right now, and it is really interesting to think about relationships with the parents, right, as being so formative of our understandings of God, right? Not only in the kind of direct way that Naomi is talking about, right, that the parents talk to you about God and teach you what their ideas about God are, right, but also that the child, sees his or her parents as gods in certain ways, right, as being so much more powerful than they are themselves, right, that the way that the parent acts, right, will influence a person's idea of God, right, and so part of becoming a mature spiritual person, right, is separating your idea of God from your idea of your parents, right, which means in a certain way, being an iconoclast, right, and cutting your parents down to size, right, making them into people rather than gods, which is that's a tough thing to do, right?
But it also means that you are becoming a person as opposed to this helpless little puddle.
Exactly.
You're balancing.
Right. And that, I think, right, is right at the heart of so much of this type of teaching, right? Right. It's not that you are helpless before God, right? It's that you are God's servant in relationship with God, right? And that's a very different. You're not actually God's slave. You're God's servant, right? Which is a very different relationship, right? One is completely asymmetrical, right? Without any recognition on the part of God that you are worth anything, right? The other one, right, is also asymmetrical, right? God is God and you're not, right? That doesn't change, right? But God, in this case, sort of recognizes you as you. Yeah, go ahead, Naomi.
There is, at least in the tradition, that a congregation can bring an indictment against God, basically saying, hey, a little attention down here, please.
Yes, right.
I heard a rabbi once coming very, very close. I really thought he was going to do it.
Yeah.
And he backed off at the last
Did he? Oh,
minute.
did he? That's very
That's
interesting.
too bad. That would have been fun to hear.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that in the modern, our contemporary period, but there's a famous story of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who did, call the Beit Din against God. Look what you're doing to your people, God. You're faithful people here in Poland, and look how we live, right? And look how we're oppressed, and look how we have to deal with pogroms and this and that and the other thing, and you have to answer to it. Right. I don't think he got an answer.
A lot of people felt like that about World War II.
Of course,
the Holocaust.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Right,
I've heard that.
right. But I think that it's
I
really,
can't find that poem.
but I think that's what's really important, right? Is that one of the things that, again, I'm no expert on this, but my sense of the Holocaust, right, is that it was so overwhelming, and God's absence was so profound, right? In that and it happened at a time in history when God was, if not dead, already died, right? And the people who were modern people, right, didn't believe in God. They had gotten rid of all that stuff, so that kind of Beit Din putting together a court and accusing God in a kind of a ritual way was not something that was really possible
Right.
in the 40s and 50s.
Did I ever send, there is a Yiddish poem written, I guess, in 1945, where 3 rabbis declare that God is not a lover of Israel.
Yes, I think you did send that to me.
Yeah,
Right.
I find it periodically.
Right, and that's the kind of thing that could happen in a Yiddish poem that probably couldn't happen in a conservative synagogue.
But there is still a sect of Judaism today that doesn't recognize Israel.
Of course.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
not
Oh,
the-
yeah. Oh, yeah.
And they run the government.
Are they in the government now? Oh, that's hysterical if that actually is
Almost.
true.
I don't know what.
The Nuri Karta is their name, and they get, I thought they were in the Iranian government because they get paraded around by the Iranian government.
Maybe, no, I guess I'm one segment to the left of them. But,
Yeah.
or, no, they're not actually in the government, but the philosophy is there.
Yeah.
Wow. And some of the parties that are in the government are off.
Oh, are scary.
Now, I had somebody say to me one time, how could God let this happen? There can't be a God if he let this happen.
Yeah.
You know,
Right. I
God
mean,
turned
very,
his
very
face
often,
away.
We
very.
lost a whole generation of Jews because of the
Right.
Holocaust, the ones that
Mhm.
survived.
Yeah.
It's very. There's a song called "Oh God" by the English band XTC, and it's such an interesting thing because it's all about how he can't believe in God, right? But whom is he addressing?
God.
He's talking to God.
Yeah.
So it's and I don't know this band well enough to know, like, is he unaware of that particular irony, right? Or is he is he someone with a real, we call it in chaplaincy we call it oh gosh, what is it, theological trauma, basically,
Oh,
right?
That's
You
that's
know,
an interesting.
you know,
concept.
where
that's
where the
that's
theology
very-
you grew up with, right, just doesn't work for you,
it's very
but you
peculiar.
also can't can't change it for another theology, right?
Yeah.
Right? And it's and atheism is possible, obviously, but I have many rabbis, but one of my rabbis says, I don't know about atheists. I really don't. I think I know a lot of people who call themselves atheists, but I really think that probably 2 of them are. Oh, who knows? Anyway, all right. Thank you, everybody. To be
Thank you,
continued.
Rabbi.
Maybe we'll do another. Maybe we'll get through 4 next time. Let's see. We've gotten through 1 per week so
Is
far.
there a 4th?
Oh, there's a whole bunch.
There's
Oh, it goes on and on and on.
There are about 3 books.
Yeah. No,
three
there's
books,
there's
exactly.
there's a lot
Pirkei
there's a
Avot.
lot of them, and you go so deep.
There's over 200 chapters in Pirkei Avot.
No, Pirkei Avot only has 6.
Oh.
Six chapters, but in the whole of the Mishnah, there's something like,
That's what I'm thinking.
yeah, I forget. I don't remember the
That's what
number.
I'm
Yeah,
thinking.
yeah.
This Jose, he's almost like a Mexican.
Yes.
Yes.
Yossi, but it's Yossi, not Ho.
Yossi.
It's Yossi, not Jose.
Yes.
All right. And I'm realizing
Thank you.
again
Thank
that
you.
despite my best efforts,
You could, like,
I